Well, you want to remember, we had a tit for tat, like the one that has taken place over the past 3 days between June 9th and June 11th. Remember, the memorandum of understanding was signed on June 17th. What I'm telling you is between the 9th and 11th, there was a tit for tat, just like this one. Involved both the Iranians and the Americans taking shots at each other 2 different times. Back in the June 9th to June 11th window, you remember an Apache helicopter was shut down. Mm-hmm. The Americans responded. The Iranians then responded. The Americans responded again, and the Iranians responded. And the same thing has happened here. It's not an Apache helicopter. It's a tanker and a cargo ship that the Iranians took potshots at in the Strait of Hormuz, and that's led to the United States taking a shot at Iran, Iran taking a shot at Iran, Iran taking a shot at the United States, and then one more round. So it's the same basic story. And a lot of people are saying, oh, this means we're on the threat of escalation. We're not on the threat of escalation. We're just trying to decide here who controls the Strait of Hormuz. That's the issue at play. And in fact, it's just been announced that we're going to sit down with the Iranians and try and work this out and put an end to this tit for tat, just as we put an end for the previous tit for tat by signing the memorandum of understanding. And by the way, once an agreement is reached, it will be clear that Iran completely controls the Strait of Hormuz.
You say that, but of course this is in keeping with what you've said time and again, John, that Iran's essentially won the war, which is why Trump has signed this memorandum of understanding, a surrender document, if you like, and that the US has no way out of this situation. That's your line. But let me put this to you. This is Mike Pence, the former US vice president who carries no brief for President Trump. He says the Iranian regime is on its heels. Its military capabilities have been seriously degraded. Its terror proxies have been weakened. Its economy remains under severe pressure. For the first time in many years, the momentum is with the US and our ally Israel. That's Mike Pence. John.
Then why did we sign the Memorandum of Understanding, which is a surrender agreement? Almost everybody who's looked at that agreement recognizes that. People on the hawkish side of the political spectrum are beside themselves, given that President Trump signed the MOU on June 17th. But President Trump signed it for one very good reason. He had no choice. Mike Pence is operating in a different universe than the rest of us are. And somebody ought to try to bring him back down to earth and feed him some facts and teach him a little basic logic. And then he might see the light. I'm not sure. But let's hope that he's not a lost cause, which he appears to be when he makes foolish statements like that.
Well, the consensus among the hawks remains pretty adamant that, Washington must go to great lengths to still dismantle the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, end the militia proxies, and restore freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. They say that Trump still has a lot of leverage. And if Tehran does not conform, especially on the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran will face the full force of the American military again. John.
Tom, let me take a minute or two just to lay out the big picture here, which will show you that that line of argument makes no sense. The war started on February 28th, and on April 8th, the air war part of it ended. So from February 28th to April 8th, we had a 40-day air war. We have not gone back to that air war or even hinted that we would go back to that air war for the past 2 months and 3 weeks. And the reason is very simple. The air war does not provide a war-winning strategy. And in fact, if we started the air war again, it would be Iran that benefited from it. So there's no air war option. Unsurprisingly, on April 13th. Remember, the air war ends on April 8th. On April 13th, President Trump switches gears and he puts into place the blockade. We go from naval power, we go from air power to naval power. The blockade is on from April 13th to June 17th. That's a little more than 2 months. What happens on June 17th? On June 17th, President Trump signs the Memorandum of Understanding, which is a surrender document. That basically means that the blockade didn't work, because if the blockade had worked, he wouldn't have signed a surrender document. Mm-hmm. He signed it because the blockade didn't work. So here we are. We've tried air power. It didn't work. And nobody's talking about going back to that. We tried a blockade or naval power. That didn't work, which again is why we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. The third option is land power. And I have not heard anybody make a serious argument that we should put boots on the ground. So the question you want to ask yourself today, Tom, is what are we going to do to up the ante? These people are talking about going up the escalation ladder and teaching the Iranians a lesson, or using all of our coercive leverage to get them to play by our rules. I'd like to know, where's the coercive leverage come from? I just told you what all the options are, and the answer is there is no option.
Yeah, but they would say to you, John, that given the state of Iran's economy, that Tehran could now be overplaying its hand in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, doesn't sanctions relief provide Washington with equally important leverage? John?
No, the point is that Iran faces an existential threat from the United States. The United States and Israel are an existential threat to Iran. And when you face an existential threat, you'll eat grass if that's what's necessary to survive. But the idea that the Iranians are suddenly going to throw up their hands and concede defeat to the United States and to Israel, there is zero evidence that that was a possibility up to now. Where's the evidence that we were on the verge of seeing that outcome? I see no evidence whatsoever. The point is, lots of people who don't like this agreement and can't accept the fact that we lost are constantly talking about getting tough, but they never get beyond saying we should get tough and describe exactly what we do and how it produces the victory they desire.
Still has to deal with his critics at home, and they're not just the neoconservatives and Republican lawmakers. They also include some Democrats. And John, they would argue that this deal, which means new revenue, a lot of revenue going to Tehran, that'll simply finance their ballistic missiles, their militia proxies. They're going to spend it on that rather than reconstruction. And the regime, if you like, will invest every penny it receives to furthering its goal of fighting Israel. John?
I think they're basically right. I wouldn't use the categorical or extreme language you use to describe it. I'd use a bit more qualified language. But as I said at the top of the show,
yes,
the Iranians won. You're exactly right. And the Hawks are beside themselves. Remember, the Hawks said that this was going to turn into a great victory for the United States and Israel. We're going to do all these wonderful things, achieve all these objectives. We've not only achieved none of our stated objectives, we've also lost on a number of other issues. And they're beside themselves. They don't know what to do. And the fact is, there's nothing we can do about it. Iran won.
Yeah, but at what point does official Washington recognize your point? Because at this stage, they seem to be giving Trump a hard time for giving too much away. John?
Well, they are giving Trump a hard time, and Trump feels like he's between a rock and a hard place. He has all those hawks in Washington, plus the Israelis on one side, and then he has a lot of people, I think, like J.D. Vance and probably Steve Witkoff on the other side, telling him that he's just got to cut a deal. And Trump is sophisticated enough to realize he has no choice here. Trump didn't sign that memorandum of understanding because he's a pussycat. He signed it because he felt he had no choice. I mean, Doug hit the nail on the head. He doesn't want to be Herbert Hoover. President Trump said explicitly that we're facing a potential economic catastrophe. He understands that. He had no choice. And all Trump is doing here is delaying the inevitable. At some point, he has to cut a deal. And by the way, Tom, you want to understand what's lurking in the background, and we haven't even talked about it at all. But what really matters, and what many people think was the principal reason we went to war against Iran, is the nuclear issue. We haven't even talked about the nuclear issue yet. And you have to understand that once we get to that, the Iranians are going to have a lot of leverage, and they're going to make it very difficult for us to get a good deal. So this situation only gets worse for us. I mean, the idea that it improves over time and we gain more and more leverage. Sorry, I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, terms. It gets back to a point that, John, we talked about this 2 months ago, and you quite rightly predicted that Trump will have to eat crow. Remember when you said that? Eat crow.
Yes.
Eating crow means acknowledging you were wrong. Can you imagine the American foreign policy establishment conceding defeat on these issues?
But there's a difference between the foreign policy establishment and President Trump. And if you listen to Doug carefully, he was talking about President Trump.
Sure.
And I think Doug is on the money. There's nothing he said that I disagree with. The strait will be open. There's no question there'll be a toll booth there. And I think that the Omanis and the Iranians, who control both sides of the strait, will work out an arrangement. By the way, the problem that exists today, Tom, is that the ships, the tankers and the cargo ships that are leaving the Gulf, for the most part, are going along the Omani coast. So what the Omanis think is Omani territorial waters. And this is what is enraging the Iranians. And the Iranians are saying any ship that goes through the strait, whether you go through Omani territorial waters or you go through Iranian territorial waters, has to have our permission, which is another way of saying we control the strait, the entire strait. This is not to say a deal won't be worked out with the Omanis over time, but at this point in time, as Arachi said, the foreign minister of Iran, we control the entire strait.
Okay, an important moment in the trajectory of American foreign policy. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, just a slightly different way of coming at it. I think that rhetoric regarding Pax Americana was appropriate during the unipolar moment when we were the only great power on the planet. Then you could think in those terms.
So this is the 1990s and the first 15 years of this century.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And of course, both Doug and I and you, Tom, were not in favor of that attempt to implement Pax Americana. You could talk about it at the time. But what happened, in my opinion, around 2017 is that we moved into a multipolar world. And we're dealing with China, we're dealing with Russia, and then we're dealing with the Middle East, the war in Iran. That's a sort of additional contingency that matters enormously. Excuse me, but if you think about what's going on in East Asia, you think about the Ukraine war, you think about the Middle East, we do not have a lot of influence in any one of those three areas. In fact, we've not had a lot of success in shutting down the Ukraine war. And with regard to East Asia, we're doing everything we can to keep things peaceful in East Asia because we know we're up to our eyeballs in alligators in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So this notion of Pax Americana, where we lead the world and everybody follows, that's long gone, in my opinion.
Hasn't Iran, though, demonstrated to US allies in Asia that America is somewhat unreliable? John?
Well, I think there is an element of truth in that. You also, just in this context, want to remember that starting in roughly 2011, when Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, talked about the pivot to Asia, began to pay a lot of attention to increasing our deterrence capability in East Asia. And that started big time under President Trump's first term started in 2017. It was then continued by President Biden in 2021 to 2025. So we have been pivoting to Asia until the Iran war. And now we're pivoting away from Asia. We pulled THAAD batteries and Patriot batteries. These are air defense batteries out of Japan and South Korea. We moved the Marine Expeditionary Unit out of Japan to the Middle East. And our East Asian allies were deeply concerned about that. And that includes the Australians as well. And I think people were beginning to wonder about how reliable the United States was. In other words, was the United States going to be there for its East Asian allies? Then there's another dimension, which is the one that you're getting at, Tom, which is that we performed pretty poorly in the war against Iran. We basically ran out of weaponry, or we had drawn down our weapons base to the point where we really couldn't continue the war. I mean, you want to understand that one of the principal reasons that we don't want to start the air war is we do not have sufficient munitions to conduct that air war. And all of this tells you if a war were to break out in East Asia at this point in time, I think the United States, from a purely military point of view, would be in real trouble. It's not to say we'd lose, because the Chinese military has all sorts of problems. But you do not want to underestimate the extent to which we have weakened ourselves by fighting this war against Iran. So things do not look good in East Asia. And by the way, Tom, one thing I've been predicting, and this is based on my experience during the Vietnam War, and I'm sure Doug remembers these years very well. But once we lost the war in Vietnam, once it was really all over with in 1975, the United States never wanted to think again about getting involved in a war in Southeast Asia or in a place like Vietnam. So what we did after 1975, for probably a good decade, was we focused laser-like on Europe. NATO and the Warsaw Pact. I would imagine that once this war in the Middle East is over with, the last thing we're going to want to think about is fighting another war against Iran or reconstructing our highly vulnerable military bases in those Gulf states. And I wouldn't be surprised, given all the emphasis we've had on the pivot to Asia since 2011, and given that China is the pacing threat, as people in the Pentagon like to say, I wouldn't be surprised if we focus laser-like on East Asia the way after the war in the Middle East, the way we focused laser-like on Europe after Vietnam. Do you guys know whether either Bill Kristol or Bob Kagan opposed the Iran war beforehand?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Do you wonder, Doug, given all of our wars since 1991, the last war that we won in any meaningful way, why anyone who is in favor of all those crazy wars we have fought since then, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Iran, isn't thinking seriously about whether their judgment was correct in the past?
To what extent do you think that the Iran debacle could mark a watershed moment in Washington, in the sense that policy planners, both among Democrats and Republicans, will redefine America's role in the world, less emphasis on the Persian Gulf, less emphasis on Europe, and more focus on Asia?
Well, I would just say there's also just another way of coming at this, Tom. One of the lessons that I hope people learn from this conflict and the previous failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, just to name two, is the limits of military power. This is a different issue than how you prioritize your interests around the world. The issue that you're raising, which is terribly important. I don't mean to take away from that.
Ends and means.
Yeah, that's the ends. That's exactly right. You were talking about the ends. I hadn't thought of it that way. And I was talking about the means. What has struck me over the years, and I'm sure this is true with Doug as well, is the extent to which hawks in the United States believe that the military provides this magic weapon for winning wars quickly and easily and doing social engineering here, there, and everywhere. I mean, the thing I learned early in life, maybe it was because I spent 10 years of my life in the military, is that the military is a blunt instrument and it doesn't always succeed in achieving the goals that's assigned to it. But if you listen to a lot of hawks in the United States over time, over the past few decades, they seem to be wildly optimistic about what you can do if you turn the American military loose. So that's the means part of the story. And I actually do think that people will now sit back and think long and hard about what you could do with military force. And by the way, Tom, some of that will have to do with the fact that we've used such a large part of our inventory of missiles and bombs and other weapons, and therefore we don't have a lot of weapons to fight a war. But also, I think people have come to realize that military force has limits. But with regard to ends, as I said to you before, I think the focus will be more on East Asia than it has been for the past few years. However, I don't foresee us really abandoning the Middle East, mainly because of the lobby. And the fact that it will go to great lengths to make sure we stay there, at least in good part, to protect Israel. And I don't see us leaving Europe. Trump has done a lot to turn over the Ukraine portfolio to the Europeans. But he still, and the United States still remains quite tied to Ukraine. So I don't see us leaving Europe in a big way anytime soon.
Okay.
Well, the point Putin was making, and so he did. This was an address on Tuesday, the 23rd, the day after the, I guess the 84th anniversary or 85th anniversary of the invasion of the Soviet Union by Russia, and he was addressing the cadets, graduates of military and intelligence and police institutions, and in making that he was noting that right now Russia is the West is making no attempts to hide its intent to go to war with Russia. They're not. I mean, they're openly talking about that within 2 to 3 years we're going to attack Russia. And Putin's point was just very simple. We've been there before. We the Russian people have been there before. We know what it means to face this kind of threat. And while the Soviet Union was not prepared to repel that invasion in 1941, the message I took from Putin was, we're more than prepared. We know it's coming, and we're going to deal with it. That was really I think he put a notice, put out a red flag that the West should see that you're getting ready to enter a hot zone. And if you follow this, the result will be the same as what happened to Germany and its European allies that attacked the Soviets, and were ultimately defeated. But this time, Russia's not going to sit back and wait to be attacked. Once it becomes clear that the West is intent on following through on this threat, Russia's going to take steps to defend itself. That was the clear message I took away from that speech.
Yeah, this is an important part, though. That is, if Russia thinks it's going to be attacked, it will not wait for the opponent to attack. I think something like this was mentioned in one of the biographies of Putin as well. That is, he learned early on, if you know a fight is unavoidable, make sure you throw the first punch. I would argue that this is one of the reasons as well. Why was not one of them, or the main reason why they invaded in February of 2022. Indeed.
Exactly. I agree.
Because in November of 2021, the US and Ukraine, they signed this charter on strategic partnership. And at that point, one of the top advisors to the former French president made the point that this signing of this charter made it convince the Russians that they would either have to attack or be attacked. So this is really the straw that broke the camel's back. And why would they wait for an attack on Crimea or Donbass? So they went in and but but how? But this is this what the Europeans are waiting for then? When they talk about we have to prepare for a future war with Russia. Is that a Russian retaliation they're talking about? Because if they really think that Russia's going to attack Europe, they would need at least to outline what the objective would be. What exactly would be the purpose of attacking Europe? I can only see one purpose. I mean, unless you believe in these fairy tales of restoring the Soviet Union, but the only purpose would be to restore its deterrent. But is then the goal to go to war?
Well, I don't know if you saw, Putin issued a response to the Germans the other day that was just scathing and sarcasm. Like the bottom line message was, why would we want to invade you and then have to be responsible for a group of transvestite, transgender, blue-haired weirdos? What do we gain from that? Sorry, we don't need that. We don't want that. You can have it. That was his basic message to him. And it was, it went on. It was like, I recall like 8 or 9 points. I thought it was actually brilliant of him how he presented it, because it was entertaining, but it was also, to the point. But Russia has to step back and look at these attacks that Ukraine are carrying out are not being carried out because Ukraine's got the expertise to do it. And the concern is you've had Ukrainian officials just of late talk about building a nuclear warhead. And there is a report out of a YouTuber by the name of Borzikman. Sometimes his reporting has been quite accurate, sometimes, questionable. But he claims that a recent arrival of a British ship in Odessa carried these yellow barrels that look to be as containing radioactive material. I'm sure Russia is now all over that, but you can't put it past the Brits of trying to do something that absolute crazy, that they would run that risk. This is, they are poking the bear. It's like they think that they can throw a punch at Russia and Russia's not going to react. And I maintain that is a dangerous assumption. Russia's been slow to anger, but once their dander is up, they are most formidable.
Well, one can understand why. Well, especially the British, because they appear to be, with the Germans, among the most aggressive one in this war. But one can understand, though, because they essentially designed a proxy war almost in a dream scenario during the Cold War. That is, to have the Ukrainians and Russians kill each other en masse, and the West would stand on the sideline. And that's essentially what's been created here, though. Mm-hmm. It's a war where the Europeans have said, well, we have to bring this war to Russian territory, which they now have. But Europe is a safe zone. So all the industrial production, all the missiles and drones, which they advertise that they're producing to attack Russia with, all of this is within European or EU territories and British territory. So this can't be touched by the Russians. And essentially, the Russians accepted this rule of the game. That is, the NATO countries can now launch long-range missiles and drones deep into Russia, and Russia is allowed to touch NATO territory. I mean, this isn't sustainable, especially now that it's becoming so much more open and larger scale, and also, as you said, the clear indication of intent, that is to fight a war once Russia has been weakened. But I was wondering, how do you see Putin's changed over time? Because last year he was all about diplomacy, Anchorage, all of this. Now we don't hear much about diplomacy anymore. The main speeches, they're about war. That is, we will achieve our objectives. We have the military power. Yes, they have keep their arms open or door open for diplomacy, but they quite obviously do not believe that we will go anywhere.
Yeah. No, he's, I think he's been, I don't want to say forced as if it's against his will, but he is cognizant of what the political pressures are, and whatever his personal desires for trying to avoid conflict, trying to avoid escalation, I think he recognizes it's reached a point now where the demands of the Russian public are such that they want stronger action. They want decisive strikes against Kiev, up to and including killing Zelensky, killing Shursky, killing the top leaderships. I mean, the reality is senior Russian officials and generals have been assassinated all along. And there's sort of this attitude, it's time for payback. But not just payback. You've got to cut the guts out of this thing and make it so that the Europeans also pay a cost. So that's why I say, when you listen to people like Medvedev, he's, I think his views are more in line with the majority of Russians than that of Putin. And so Putin in a way is playing a little bit of catch up. Now, I don't deny that the military strategy is not being set by Putin, it's being set by Gerasimov. But again, it's up to, the Russians have not asked me how to fight this war, and I'm not sure my advice would be all that salient. But I think we've now reached a stage where the Europeans are going to must pay a price for enabling this violence. Otherwise, they will continue to escalate it to a point that it will lead to a nuclear strike, and that's the danger. That in the efforts to avoid it, Russia's taking the very actions that will actually make it more possible.
Well, one can understand, though, the restraint of Putin, because if they now begin to hit back against the NATO country, as Mark Rutte, not to take him too seriously, but would argue, then the response will be absolutely fierce. But these people seem to think this is a computer game or of some sort, or at least that there's proper escalation control, that they can do this, and if the Russians retaliate, then they will be able to manage this. I don't think anyone's going to be able to control the escalation once the Russians finally retaliate. But the whole idea is, the Russians do not dare until they do dare, as they did in 2022, and then it's completely unprovoked, and this is the time to stand up, against the new Hitler. It's, we know what the script will look like after the Russian retaliation, which is why it's quite dangerous. But what is being the thinking here on the European side, though? Because let's be honest, the Europeans, they are declaring the intent, but they hardly have the capabilities. So, well, not yet. If the Russians wait much longer, then they might have more capabilities.
Yeah, you use the word there, thinking, implying that the Europeans are thinking, engaged in a rational thought process. I, for the life of me, don't know what they are thinking, because it's so illogical. That you step back and say, okay, whether I'm Germany or Poland or France or the United Kingdom, do I need to pay more for oil and natural gas, or do I need to pay less? Is it better for my country if I pay less? Well, in the world of logic, it's better if you pay less. But the choice, in particular with the Germans, is no. We're going to cut off all ties with Russia, who supplies cheap oil and gas. We will stand by and do nothing while the United States blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, compelling us as Europeans that we now must buy more expensive liquid natural gas from the United States. And in fact, we're going to ban any kind of economic interaction with Russia, which is going to weaken our economies, cause recessions, cause inflation, cause higher unemployment. And you're doing this consciously. They're doing this, they're choosing to do this. And then on top of it, say, oh yeah, and then we're going to take on Russia and we're going to fight it and defeat it. And you're going, let me see if I got this straight. You like the UK, you can't even fill a football stadium with your army. It's so small. Your once leading edge prowess in the world of maritime operations, that's gone. That's history. Germany, with these factories that once churned out, some of the most leading edge military equipment, are shuttered. And many of your factory jobs are now going overseas to the United States or other places. So here is Europe. They remind me of, think back to when you were in high school, or whatever you called the education before you go to college. And there are the sports teams. And the guy who is the star soccer player, football player on that team, when they're 17, 18, strong, virile, quite athletic. Well, now he's 60 years old. He weighs twice what he did back then, can barely run, but in his mind still thinks he's that 17, 18-year-old football player. That's Europe. They still think that they're this military power that dominated the 19th century, and they're not. They're a hollowed out shell of a continent where the military power has been, is really inconsequential. They're in the, if you're going to take them to a dog show, they're in the Chihuahua class, and yet they're wanting to take on Germany, who's in the Rottweiler class. Sorry.
Russia.
Russia, not Germany. My mistake. But Russia's in, I was saying Rottweiler, Germany. But now Russia is the Rottweiler class. I mean, they're this big dog. Europe, a bunch of yappy little dogs that, they have no significant economic resources. They've lost their industrial edge. They're not doing anything that's on the leading edge of science and technology. They're not leading in space. I mean, there's not a single sector you can point to where Europe, you go, yeah, this is, the future could lie with them. They're living on a legacy.
Yeah. Now, I've been trying to make sense of the European position as well, because I always make the point that I think that, the Russians are fighting an existential war. The Ukrainians as well, I think, to a large extent, this can also end Ukraine. So they also have a reason to fear an existential threat. So they both make sense. The Americans, they started this to knock out a key rival. It didn't work. They hand it over outsource it to the Europeans, also makes sense. But the Europeans really, really don't make much sense. And, one could try to engage people in this political leadership in discussions to dig out, to find out what exactly is the logic here, what you want to achieve, how do you intend to achieve it based on your resources. But if you look across all the countries in the EU, the politicians, the media, they only communicate in cliches, these emotional slogans. Anything that deviates from it is censored. I mean, there's a massive cost for anyone breaking with the narrative of the group. One gets the impression there's a mass psychosis forming. And if one would argue, well, if our territories are used to strike against Russia, wouldn't that push the Russians to retaliate, possibly, resulting in nuclear war? That's Putinist, because in any word of caution sounds like one wants to restrain the attacks on Russia, and that means you're with the Russians. Yeah. So, and no one can dissent. I mean, the idea that we have freedom of speech, dialogue, discussion, it's nonsense. There's none of the sort in Europe now. It's a loony bin, and there's no other objectives now than defeating Russia. All of this talk about, they put forward some plans about, opening diplomacy with Russia, but, the set conditions, which essentially is for Russia to capitulate first. But beyond the hatred of Russia, though, do you think you hinted towards the inability or its lack of place in the world? It doesn't have the role it did in the past anymore. It doesn't really have a clear economic future. The partnership with the US is going away. Is this just desperation, you think, reflecting a wider problem?
Well, there's actually a reality that's going to descend on Europe within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And this is the fallout from the shutdown of the Persian Gulf. and Iran closing off the Strait of Hormuz. So, there has been a dramatic loss of 5 significant, I'll call them commodities, but they are inputs into the global economy. At least 20% of the oil, 25% of the liquid natural gas, 25 to 30% of the sulfur and urea, which go for fertilizer, and over 40% of the helium, which is used for making computer chips, among other things. Well, right now, on the oil front, the United States is within 2 weeks will essentially have run out of having a reserve supply of diesel and aviation fuel. So they won't have enough oil, the heavy or sour crude that's required to make diesel and aviation fuel. It'll be sort of week to week, depending upon what they can receive, because the United States is already a net importer of that. Well, the same for Europe. Europe is a net importer of oil, of all classes of oil, and the shortages that are going to come will affect the economies dramatically. They're already sort of barely bumping along, staying, maybe slightly above zero, but we're talking now that it'll be recession, if not depression territory. And oddly enough, Donald Trump talked about this 2 weeks ago at the G7, and that was, I think, that helped explain why he signed the MOU, because he recognized in 4 weeks, we could be running on zero as far as the kind of crude oil that's needed to produce diesel and aviation fuel. So Europe is in a worse situation than the United States, because the United States at least has some is independent, produces enough of the light oil that is used to produce gasoline. And it's actually been shipping some of that to Europe as well. But Europe doesn't have that. And it's on the issue of the heavy crude, the middle distillates part of the oil, from which you get diesel and aviation fuel. And that's going to be a critical shortage here. And we're not talking months, we're talking weeks. So we're going to have a dramatic, differently looking world probably by July 15.